Yeah, this is our last webinar. We're going to take a summer break and then we'll resume again in September. Taylor Brown will be talking to us about some work she's been doing across many different lakes in North America with cisco and whitefish. But if you want to sort of take the time to look back on some of our previously recorded webinars, Renee kindly just put the link in the chat, and we've been getting a lot of really good views on some of those. Some of those have more than 100 views. So we've been doing this for, don't know, 3 years maybe or so. So with that, I'm going to introduce our two speakers. And then Katelyn, you can go ahead and just start sharing your screen during the introduction. Katelyn King got her bachelor's in science from the University of Mary Washington, which is in Virginia. She then came to Michigan, where she got her PhD in fisheries and wildlife at Michigan State, working with Dr. Kendra Cheravelil, and that was on some spatial scale analysis of inland lake and stream communities. She then transitioned to the University of Michigan, where she did a postdoctoral appointment with Dr. Karen Alofs, who also was really involved in our Coregonine restoration support. So she spent a couple of years looking at historical inland lake data from the state, and then looking at fish species abundance and size structure, and then shifted and did some of the work that she's going to be talking about today on habitat suitability modeling in support of Coregonine restoration. This past year, she began a new position with Michigan DNR as the fishery research biologist. She's coordinating statewide inland lake status and trends program and other research to support fisheries management in the state. Laura Lee will then be talking about our population viability models in Lake Erie. Laura got her bachelor's in science in oceanography at Millersville University, which is in Pennsylvania. She then got her master's in science and fisheries and wildlife with a minor in statistics at North Carolina State University. Laura's had a really impressive career working for the states of Virginia and Rhode Island, and most recently North Carolina. As a stock assessment biologist in North Carolina, she headed the Division of Marine Fisheries stock assessment efforts for many commercially and ecologically important species, working tightly with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We're lucky that she joined the Great Lakes community in 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Northeast Fisheries Center, where she is a population dynamics modeler focusing on Coregonine population viability analyses, in which she will share with you after Katelyn's talk. So with that, look forward to these two talks, and please stick around for questions afterwards. Thanks, Katelyn.
Thanks, Bo, for the introduction. So yeah, as Bo mentioned, I currently work for the DNR, but this research started during my postdoc with the University of Michigan and USGS. So I'll share a little bit of that work today. So as most of you all are probably aware, paragonines in the Great Lakes have really declined, especially in the mid-1900s and the early 2000s. And I'm going to be focusing on cisco today and in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And so because of this decline, Great Lakes fishery managers have increasingly expressed support for action to increase diverse fisheries and to restore habitat in the Great Lakes. And so as a part of that movement, this framework was created that Bo and others developed, and it was endorsed basin-wide by Great Lakes fisheries managers. And so my work falls in this orange planning section with describing and mapping historical and contemporary populations and habitats, and then, using those to contribute to planning restoration actions. So our first request to implement this approach was from managers in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And we've worked on modeling several species, but as I mentioned, today we're going to focus on Artidae in these two lakes. And so the overall method that was proposed was to use information that we have on abundance or observations, occurrences in the Great Lakes, and then collect all the environmental variables that we have basin-wide. Fit models to look at suitable habitats and the relationship between habitats and occurrence within the Great Lakes, then be able to map this suitability and produce thresholds if we want to look at the most suitable habitats, and then to also be able to designate spatial units. And so comparing areas that historically and currently may support populations, or maybe historically they had populations that currently they are absent. And so some of you are probably familiar with the Schaefer et al. Paper that did some previous work modeling cisco spawning habitat. They modeled predicted spawning locations for Lakes Erie and Ontario combined, and they used the widely known Goodyear spawning atlas data for their historical spawning observations. And so my work builds on Hannah's work with more historical observational data that I'll talk about in a little bit, and some new environmental layers that are representative of the historical period that we're trying to model. And so because we have more observations, we're able to do lake-specific models and kind of compare the similarities and differences across the lakes. So I had two kind of goals or questions that I'll focus on for this talk. First is, what are the key habitat features and spawning locations for these historical cisco populations? And is there evidence of historical or current viable populations of cisco in each of these lakes? And I just want to define and point out that we really focused our observations on spawning cisco. So we wanted to narrow it down to be representative of self-sustaining populations. And so when I talk about spawning observations, this is when the historical original source stated that it was a spawning grounds, or that eggs were recovered, or that the fish had some sort of physiological evidence of spawning, such as being gravid or expressing eggs or having spawning tubercles or something like that. And so the new historical observations come from Corey Brandt and others. These data were just published on ScienceBase, and there's a data paper currently in progress to describe more about the process behind collecting these data. This data set, we call it CoreHist. It includes the Goodyear data, and they were corrected spatially, and then it includes many more observations verified as spawning from maps and journals and field notes and other sources. And so we're able to have about twice as many observations as was originally found in Goodyear. And so, as I mentioned, for the models, we really focused on spawning, but the CoreHist database does include other observations like possible spawning or nursery habitats and things like that. So this is just to give you an idea of all of the historical spawning observations that we had for Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. I will point out that some of the observations are in rivers, and I don't have environmental variables for those locations, and so they weren't included in the model, but I think it's worth noting that historically there was evidence of spawning observed in some of the tributaries. So I used MaxScent. MaxScent model uses presence-only data and an algorithm that compares the locations of where the species were found to a whole suite of environmental variables that are available within the study region. And it compares those two distributions. I also used five-fold cross-validation, which means that I ran the model 5 times and randomly pulled out 80% for training and 20% for testing. And so all of my results will be averaged over those 5 models. So for the environmental variables, we tried a combination of many of the variables that are available. Many of these are you can find in GLAF, but so things like bathymetry, reefs, fetch, distance to rivers, distance to wetlands, mean circulation magnitude or underwater currents, bottom slope, historical substrate, as well as some metrics for ice. And so I mentioned that we had some newer variables that represent the historical time period. And so this historical substrate layer was produced by folks at the Nature Conservancy, and they're working on publishing that. And we worked with folks from NOAA to develop and hindcast some spatial layers of ice duration, and that data and manuscript are currently under review as well for publication. So from all of these variables, we tried a combination of many models and selected the variables that were not strongly correlated and chose the best model. So for Lake Erie, that ended up being this historical substrate, the probability of reefs, the coefficient of variation of ice duration. So that represents kind of the variability across years of the historical period. Fetch, distance to delta wetlands, as well as those underwater currents or circulation magnitude. Variables that were important in Lake Ontario, some of them were very similar. So substrate, ice duration in this case, instead of the variation, fetch, and then bathymetry was the most important variable. Kind of similar to reefs, but a little bit different metric there. So we used area under the curve, or AUC, to evaluate how well the model was performing. And so a range of 0.8 to 0.9 is considered excellent. In this case, we got an excellent model for Lake Erie. And if we look at the relationship between our environmental variables and the habitat suitability score, these are like marginal effects curves, and they show how that habitat suitability will change as the environmental variable is varied when we keep all the other variables in the model at their average value. And so reefs was the most important driver for Lake Erie. So as you increase in reef probability, the habitat suitability increases. Distance to delta wetlands was kind of a different relationship. So as you get further away, the probability decrease, but then it increases. Again, kind of a mid-range there. Fetch, so increase in fetch is correlated to a decrease in suitability. And then as far as the historical substrate, we found a diversity of substrates. Clay, rocky, and sand were had the most suitable habitat for our model. And then I didn't show circulation and ice duration here. They weren't as important, so I didn't include their graphs. Lake Ontario, bathymetry was the most important. So cisco mostly occurring and had suitable habitat in those most shallow locations. Similar relationship to fetch as we saw in Lake Ontario. Ice duration, so as you increase in ice duration, suitability increases. And then substrate was not as important in Lake Ontario. but mud and rocky substrates had the best or the most likelihood of suitability for Cisco. So now get to see what this looks like spatially. So again, this is the average spawning habitat suitability across those 5 models. And so you can see that um, the higher color or the redder, warmer colors are better suitability than the dark blue colors are not as suitable. And so the highest suitability here are like around some of the islands along the coast. And I guess it's also notable to point out that here along Long Point, you've got predicted high suitability, but we don't have any observations there. So I think that that's interesting and that's worth noting. We do have some observations of like possible spawning or nursery habitat in that area, but not not any observations with this specific spawning designation. And then the map for Lake Ontario looks very different. And so it's really, there is some, the colors might be hard to see, but some mid-range suitability, lighter yellows along the coast. But really these bays, and they're covered by the observations, are uh, lit up in red here around the coast of Lake Ontario. So just a couple of conclusions. I think that having more historical data improved the model performance. Um, we also saw that some environmental variables that were important for Cisco spawning, things like the presence of reefs or the shallow bays, which corroborates with other findings in the Great Lakes that have found Cisco spawning on shoals. Um, and this diversity of substrate as well. So being found on sandy, rocky, silty substrates. And then, similarly to what Schaefer found in their paper is fetch and this influence of being close to tributaries. Our variable was delta wetlands, so potentially wetlands as a nursery habitat, but also just that proximity to tributaries, which we saw historically as Cisco have been found in spawning in some of those rivers. And then longer ice duration. So again, that ice cover over the winter may help protect the eggs and give them a better chance of survival. So we're hoping that managers can use this information to determine suitable habitat for stocking decisions or for restoration targets. And then these maps can also be used for delineating spatial units of viable Cisco populations. And so I just wanted to expand on that a little bit. The maps were used to delineate spatial units. And so a team of experts gathered in Ann Arbor in February of 2024 for Lake Erie. And so they used various sources of evidence, including observations, DNA evidence, and the habitat suitability maps to determine what they thought were viable populations historically for Cisco. So they fell in this bin. Cisco are currently extirpated from Lake Erie, but they were historically present, and the experts ended up delineating Lake Erie into an eastern and western population. Similarly, for Cisco in Lake Ontario, a different team of experts gathered in Niagara Falls last fall, and they kind of had 2 bins here. Some areas that were historically present and currently absent, but also determined some areas where historically and currently we have some viable cisco populations. And so they've got this one unit here that is sort of unknown, but we think that historically there were viable cisco populations, and maybe especially here in Hamilton Bay. And then they delineated two other currently occupied units. So the Bay of Quinte has a population, and then potentially a second population here in these bays, Irondequoit Bay, Sodus Bay, and Chameau Bay. So if we look back at the framework, the next step after the gap analysis, which I just described, is to compile data and conduct population viability analysis. And that's what Laura is going to be talking about next. And just quickly before she starts her talk, I wanted to thank the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and the Corrigonian Restoration Template for funding this research.
Okay. Hopefully, Katelyn, if you could give me a nod that you can see, just want to double check again. Thank you. So thank you for that great transition into my talk, and Bo, thank you for the kind introduction. This afternoon I'm going to be talking about a population viability analysis on the Lake Erie Cisco. Before I start, there are a ton of people that have contributed to this work. This list is not, I realize this list isn't exhaustive, but these are mostly the experts who helped at our experts workshop that I'll describe in a few slides. So I'll just give a brief history of the Cisco in Lake Erie. Some of this Katelyn already touched on, but maybe I'll have a little bit more detail on the commercial landings history. So in the early 20th century, Cisco, which were also known as lake herring. So if you look in the historical documents, or you'll see lake herring instead of Cisco. They supported the largest commercial fishery in the Great Lakes. The catches in Lake Erie averaged about 10,000 metric tons a year from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. However, the fishery collapsed in 1925. There was a small fishery that persisted after that in the Eastern Basin. There was this little what you call like a last gasp in the mid-40s. There was a little rise there in the commercial landings, but population in Lake Erie is now considered extirpated. There are still populations in Lake Superior and Lake Ontario, and what are considered remnant populations in Lakes Michigan and Huron. Because they're extirpated, stocking is going to be the primary management tool to initiate restoration, and the broodstock source is going to, for now anyways, is going to be Lake Huron. Population viability analysis is going to be used to assess the recovery potential of Cisco and Lake Erie. This is, one of several tools you can use for evaluating population persistence, and we're going to look at various scenarios based on different underlying assumptions about the population. So, what are the different ways this population that we really don't know anything about, how could it be built up? In October of last year, we had 2 workshops for experts that we invited, and the panelists were asked to work with the modeling team to make decisions on input parameters and modeling strategies. And this was super helpful, given that, again, the population's extirpated, so we don't know, what would a current population of Cisco and Lake Erie look like? So next, we're going to get into how the model was built, the population viability analysis, or PVA. We chose to use a Leslie matrix model. And so the population dynamics are described by that first equation you can see, where n in next year, y+1, next year's population is the product of this year's population times survival and fertility. So the ones the recruits to the population, as well as those who survived from last year. And that's what the Leslie matrix there, represented by A, is showing. In the top row, we have the fertilities. That's basically your reproduction. And then on the subdiagonal are your survival rates. And we assumed a maximum age of 15, which is a plus group, so they could get older than that. It's just a convenient way for summarizing those older ages. We assumed an annual time step and projected the population forward for 50 years, which is several lifespans. And for each model scenario that we ran 10,000 simulations. Now, why did we run 10,000 simulations? Well, as I said, we don't know anything about what a current population in Lake Erie would look like. So we're basically borrowing parameters from extant populations. And there's so many different combinations. So we're randomly choosing as many as we can. And we're trying to capture the potential variability in what the life history characteristics may look like. So I'm going to describe those elements that are in the Leslie matrix, and we'll start with the fertilities or reproduction that are on that first row. And that's comprised of female maturity at age, fecundity at age, and then early life stage survival. And it's divided by 2 because we're assuming we're doing a female only model. So we're assuming all the offspring that we're working with are female. And the early life stage survival is comprised of 3 stages: the egg, fry, and age 0 or fingerling, whichever term you prefer to use there. So I'm going to go show you quickly each of these. This is what the maturity at age ogive looks like that we're assuming in the model. Basically, all fish are fully mature by age 4, pretty much age 3, because that's 0.99. And this is taken from a paper by Ben Rook in his Green Bay data. There are 4 parameter sets for fecundity that are available from the literature that are being used as inputs into our model. And so for each of those 10,000 simulations, the model's randomly picking one of these four curves or lines to estimate fecundity in the model. Early life stage survival, as I mentioned, is made up of egg, fry, and age 0 stages. And these are drawn from, those simulations are drawn from beta distributions characterizing each of these. And I've given the mean survival that's used. It's also characterized by a variance, which I'm not showing. But again, for each of those 10,000 simulations, it's pulling one value from each of these distributions. For age 1+ survival, we're deriving from life history parameters. So there's an assumed relationship between natural mortality and weight. And to get to that, we need to get to weighted age. And so that relies on a age-length relationship and a length-weight relationship. And you can see we have 4 different age-length relationships and 5 different length-weight relationships. Again, the model is randomly picking one of each of these in each simulation. And then for each of those simulations, it's calculating the natural mortality from the assumed relationship between natural mortality and weight, which is shown there. And then from there, it calculates the survival at age. To add additional realism to our model simulations, that vector of age-specific survival rates also varies within each year of each simulation. And we do this by randomly selecting an error and adding that value to the entire vector of survival at age for the given year. And this is just to show you, I ran 10,000 simulations and took the median of all those values just to show you what on average the survival is looking like for these model scenarios. And it's averaging around 60% survival over all ages 1 and up. Excuse me. Hatchery origin fish in the model have several assumptions. One is that their survival is half that of wild fish in their first year in the model. Also, even even if they're mature, they can't produce offspring in the first model year. And this is just to give them time sort of to acclimate to the environment. Any offspring from the stock fish are considered wild, and just for convenience, they're tracked separately from the wild fish in the model. Stocking in our model scenarios occurs in the first 10 years of each of the simulations. In the fall, in our model, we're stocking just over 1 million age 0 fish and 600,000 age 1 fish in the spring. And these numbers come from what the current maximum potential would be from Lamar and Allegheny hatchery facilities. And to add realism, similar like we did with survival, we're adding some variation on the stocking numbers just to account for the variation in the stocking process. So here we have our different model scenarios. Our base model is basically everything as I described up to this point. And one important note is that the egg survival there is about 0.8%. And this value for egg survival is taken from a study of cisco egg survival in Lake Ontario. And that study evaluated egg survival at different depths for both control and experimental habitat types. So this value in the base run is the average from the control part of that experiment. In our model scenario that I'm calling experimental habitat, the egg survival is about 10%. And this is the average from that same study from the experimental habitat types. We also looked at a scenario with maximum growth and fecundity. And basically, we focused on Lake Michigan for our parameter values because those cisco seem to have the highest growth and the highest fecundity. Finally, for each of these 3 scenarios, base, experimental habitat, and maximum growth and fecundity, in the base model of all of those, we're not assuming anything about the size of year class strength. So, but cisco are known to have intermittent year class booms. So we added that in another set of scenarios. So for each of these 3, we looked at recruitment booms occurring every 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 years. The main outputs that we'll be looking at from these models are lambda and the population size by origin. And by origin, I mean whether it's hatchery origin or wild origin. Lambda is the population growth rate. Here in our modeling, we calculated lambda just for the post-stocking years, so after stocking ended, and only for the wild fish. But it's still an index of population change just after stocking. And lambdas less than 1 indicate that the population is decreasing. Lambda that's about equal to 1 means the population is stationary, and that just means that the population is exactly replacing itself from one time step to the next. And finally, lambdas greater than 1 indicate an increase in population. So ideally, you want to see greater than or equal to 1 for a positive outcome. We can get right into the model results. And here you should see 6 different plots. The top 3 plots show the distribution of the lambda values over the 10,000 simulations for the base run, which is on the left, the experimental habitat run, which is in the middle, and the maximum growth and fecundity run, which is on the right. The dashed line shows the median over all those simulations, and the value written there is what the dashed line represents. So for example, for the base run, the median lambda was 0.77, so less than 1, and suggests a decrease in population, which you can see in the lower graphs are showing population size for both the hatchery origin fish, which is in the yellow, and wild origin fish, which is in the blue. And the shaded areas represent the uncertainty as the interquartile range. For the base run, as I said, lambda is less than 1. You can see that soon after stocking, the population quickly goes to 0. It doesn't get much higher than that, but again, because lambda is less than 1, it declines over the time series. For the experimental habitat model, lambda is greater than 1, so that means an increasing population. You can see from the blue line, which I don't know if I mentioned, the lines represent the median over the 10,000 simulations. It's greatly increasing over the time series, though note that it has a very wide uncertainty band around it. And finally, for the maximum growth and fecundity run, the lambda, again, like the base run, is less than 1, and so indicates the declining population, which you can see on the graph, the lower graph. The next 3 slides are going to show the results of the recruitment boom scenarios. So this first graph shows the results of the recruitment booms applied to the base scenario. This is what is known as a violin plot. It shows violins with a box plot in the center. The violins represent the kernel density of the lambda distribution over the 10,000 simulations, and then it's just your typical box plot shown inside there. On top of each violin is the median lambda value shown for over those 10,000 simulations. So the first violin is just the base run, as we saw in the previous slide. Again, the lambda was 0.77. After that, you see the results from applying 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10-year recruitment booms. That means on average, every 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10 years, there's an exceptionally large year class. And we made that year class large by increasing the early life stage survival. And in the case of the base model, recruitment booms are not pushing that lambda over 1. We get very close to 1 with intermittent booms of every 2 years, but nothing over 1. Little more positive results for the experimental habitat runs. You can see that in all scenarios, lambda is greater than 1, which is expected because without the recruitment booms, it's greater than 1. So adding the recruitment booms is just going to be even greater than the value for no recruitment booms. So you can see all these lambda values are greater than 1. Finally, for the maximum growth and fecundity model, we have sort of a mix of results. If you recall, lambda was less than 1 without recruitment booms. When you add recruitment booms, you have to be at least as frequent as 6 years till you get a lambda that's greater than or equal to 1. So at 6 years, you get a lambda of 1.01, and then at 4 and 2 years, lambda just continues to increase. So some summary points. Adequate egg survival is required for successful reintroduction, even if frequent booms in year class strengths occur. So, if true egg survival in Lake Erie is equivalent to that in our base model scenario, so that 0.8%, even the frequent booms in year class strength are not going to overcome this life history bottleneck, and so the population would quickly decline in the absence of stocking. Also, any potential reintroduction of cisco to Lake Erie should be viewed as experimental. And research, we should focus our research on documenting whether natural spawning occurred and quantifying that egg survival, because that parameter is just so important to their population's persistence. I'm going to kind of switch gears and just devote a few slides to an R-Shiny app that we developed to run this model, just because there's just an infinite number of combinations of scenarios that you can look at. We thought it would be helpful if people could run the scenarios themselves, because we can't capture everything in a single paper. So sorry, I should go back to that. The link is given here. The code is on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service GitHub repository. I can pop that link into the chat when I'm done the presentation. So this is the landing page. You do need the newest version of R to run this, or R Studio. This is what it looks like. You can see on the left, there's a menu that gives you information and also directs you to all the different options that you have. For example, this is the menu for the proposed stocking. You can vary the number of years you want to stock fish, how many ages you want to stock, and then once those two are configured, the table below adjusts to the correct size, and then you can fill that table in with your stocking numbers. Once you run the model, it's going to give you results. It'll give you a little model summary about some, the choices you made, some, general summary statistic, and some figures. I couldn't fit all the figures on this slide, but I think there's 4 figures that it shows you that characterize the results. Finally, what are our future plans now that we've mostly have this modeling complete? This is going to give us some information for more detailed restoration planning for Greganines. That's for sure. Hopefully, we can use this to guide us in the development of restoration targets. We can use this to evaluate different stocking methods. As I said, there's so many different combinations we can use. So this is something we can definitely pursue. Also, help us develop benchmarks for egg survival. So some work we've started is looking at, what is the egg survival needed to make each of those model scenarios work. And finally, we can adapt this model for bloaters and lake whitefish in the other Great Lakes and other Greganines as needed. And that's all I have, and I'm happy to take any questions or go back to another slide.
Okay, fantastic job, Laura and Katelyn. Nice compliment there. Seeing the maps of the spawning habitat suitability from Katelyn, and then Laura talking about the importance of habitat suitability in the model, how sensitive the model is to that egg survival parameter. And as Laura alluded to there are plans to do some experimental stocking of cisco in Lake Erie starting this year. Those will be yearling cisco from Lake Huron. They'll be going into the New York waters of Lake Erie. So it's not a basin-wide large stocking, but it's just an opportunity to learn how well cisco might do in a small scale there and experimentally. So let's see, already some comments going on here. So if you'd like to ask a question, please, you can put it into the chat, or even ideally, yeah, perfect. Raise your hand just like Vic did, throw your camera on, and we can have a good old conversation across the Zoom here. So Vic.
Yeah, no, I really like the combination of talks, the way you put them together and the way they fit into the framework. We've gone over that, for a couple of years now, and it's great to see actual data and actually what's being done, at least from a manager perspective like me. Laura, I wondered one question I had in your assumptions. You kind of assumed stocked eggs or whatever are going to have half the survival of wild eggs. Was that correct? I'm just wondering how you came to that assumption. Was that from literature, or maybe you mentioned it and I missed it? But it
No,
seems
that's a
like
good.
it'd be pretty important to the results of the models, and I just wondered what.
Sure. So I think the assumption you're talking about is that the survival of the stock fish is half that of the wild fish. That's just the first model year when they first enter the population for that first year. We just assume that they're probably not as surviving as well as the wild fish, and so we thought half survival sounded just as good as any other value. I mean, it's definitely something
Okay.
we can explore, but as far as I know, there's no literature that backs that up, but it just seemed like a very reasonable assumption on our part.
Yeah, I have no backing for it, but I would think it might be even lower, but that's
Oh,
just my take. But anyway, thank you.
So there were, like, maybe you could sort of reiterate, Laura, just there were 2 egg survival sort of scenarios there. And maybe just reiterate sort of the base model, like where those estimates came from again, and sort of again, how we don't have a lot of empirical data to really back that up, except for Chameau Bay and Lake Ontario.
right. So that the work that Weidel did, he was looking at egg survival at different depths and for control and experimental habitat. And that's really, as far as I know, the only egg survival data we have to go on for Cisco. And so we use the control and the average of the control average over depths for our base model, and then the average over depths for the experimental substrate for that experimental habitat model.
Yeah, and that experimental habitat was essentially a constructed reef. So where there would be better like interstitial spaces and all of those good things we think about for spawning habitat. So
It seems really important to, if you're going to introduce, to have that habitat available, or to target that habitat, and not just, otherwise you're probably spinning wheels, right?
exactly. And that's where sort of Katelyn's model can help us sort of zero in on sort of good places to, to think about where to stock those fish, if they're going to home back there or, come back there to spawn.
Yeah, can't wait to see this work being done on Lake Michigan.
Yeah. So coming up, this same group, although Katelyn is leaving us, there's a new scientist, Peter Flood, that'll be sort of taking over her role, but definitely will be conducting this in Lake Michigan for Cisco and for Kai, probably in 2026 sometime.
Yep. Really good. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good questions, Vic. Thanks.
I can answer a question in the chat, Bo. There was one from Jay. So there's a question about the area of Lake Erie, Long Point, that I highlighted that had high suitability, but we didn't have any observations there. And so, yeah, that area. So the model is showing that area has some of those environmental variables that are favorable to where Cisco were spawning in other places in the lake, but we don't have observations there, so likely, there's low fetch there, and those substrates that I listed are in that area, and some good ice duration and things like that. So that's not to say that they weren't spawning there, but that habitat is suitable. I don't know of any factors that maybe someone else that is more of a Erie expert that knows that area well might have an idea of why they historically weren't spawning there, but there was some evidence. I know we had, like I said, we used the very specific spawning designation. So there were some other observations of Cisco there that were noted as like nursery habitat. So it is possible that they were potentially spawning there, but we just don't have the data that says that.
Yeah, it's a really good question and one of the really interesting results from your model, Katelyn. And so could be an area for future research, or if people happen to know something about maybe whitefish distributions like contemporarily there in that region. I don't know how many people we have from Ontario on the call, but feel free to chime in. Let's see, we've got two questions here. Let's go with one more in the chat and then we'll go to Ellery and then Taylor. And so this question, are you working with Indigenous groups in your data collection? And so this could be data with respect, especially with historical or contemporary spawning habitats, or I guess some of the parameters that Laura used in her model. I could try to address that. We don't have Corey on, but Katelyn, did you want to try to address that at least for the spawning habitat?
I believe that Corhist has some Indigenous data for Lake Ontario. But yeah, I'm not sure. Corey would know more about the sources of those data. Maybe you know, Bo, or Andrew's raising his hand.
Yeah, I could add a little bit, Bo, if you wanted. That's a really good question.
Yes.
The methods themselves were designed with input from several Indigenous communities. We had representatives who worked on developing the methods, and the methods are such that they're designed to bring Indigenous knowledge into the process. On the lower lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, we reached out to several communities, and we didn't have any that kind of came forward and wanted to participate in the process of specifically bringing Indigenous knowledge to the process there. That does not mean that there's not interest. It was more around the sort of notion of capacity at the time to become involved. We are, however, currently in the process of forming some relationships for the upcoming assessments on Lake Michigan, and I think we're optimistic for the first time we'll have concurrent Western science process and Indigenous knowledge process going on there. So really good question, and we're working that. One other thing I'll add is that the process is designed such that we don't have to have Indigenous knowledge at the time of assessment. That can come if communities become interested, or asynchronously if knowledge becomes available and folks have the capacity to be involved. Those models and things can be updated, so the results are kind of living, I guess, and the assessment process can be updated at any time. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit more. Thank you.
Perfect, Andrew. Thanks. And if there are any Indigenous groups on the call and would like to become more involved or learn more about this, feel free to reach out to Andrew Muir, amure@glfc.org, or myself, dbonnell@usgs.gov. We're always looking to broaden those relationships and partnerships. All right, let's go, Ellery, with your hand up. Hi there.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question for Katelyn. Also, this is random. Katelyn, I don't expect you to remember me. I was also in the ALOFS lab, but I think it would have been during the pandemic, so I don't think we ever saw each other in person, but I don't expect you to remember me. Anyway, hello. I apologize. I don't have a lot of experience with modeling, and I was kind of curious about um, any potential kind of interaction between some of the physical environmental factors, like if, for example, for whatever reason, shallower areas also had similar substrate, and if there was any kind of potential interaction or nesting with some of those variables. And I was curious how you accounted for that, or if that even needed to be accounted for.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is true that some of the variables are interacting. So, for example, areas of low fetch likely have, higher ice duration and
Okay.
things like that. And so you can run correlation analyses similar to what you would do for your variables, like in non-spatial modeling. Um, you can pull random points and look to see how they correlate. And so we tried to, like I said, we ran a lot of combinations of variables, tried to select ones that were not correlated, by swapping in and out, like fetch versus ice, and seeing what was the better model. And there are also, I showed the marginal effects plots, but there are also plots that will show you if just that environmental variable is used in the model without anything else. And so you can see there too, like, is there a change in that correlation if I don't have other variables in the model? So you get an idea of how, like, bathymetry might be affecting ice or something like that. So
Mhm. That's interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellery. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Let's see. Gavin Galini has a question in the chat, and then we'll go to Taylor. So Gavin wants to know what happened to Cisco in 1925 in Lake Erie. Laura, I think you had the plot that showed that.
Yeah,
Okay.
basically, that's when they considered that the population crashed. And I just pulled up I showed a quote from a 1927 report, and I just pulled that report up and I was reading it, and basically, I think it was mostly overexploitation. The fish, they were allowed to catch fish of any size at any time, and as many as they wanted. So just super unregulated fishery, I think, was the main cause at that time.
Yeah, I think that's the consensus. Incredible. There's a lot of some images, not only of some of the harvests and the Earl Best, for example, but also just seeing how many nets they had in the water. Corey Brandt's been able to find some historical documentation of that. Also, that time was, or prior to that time, there was also some habitat destruction that probably was not helpful in places like the Detroit River, which would have been one of their key spawning areas. But most people do seem to think, Gavin, that it was overfishing that was the main blow there. Okay, good question. Let's go to Taylor.
Yeah, both of these talks have been super interesting. I have many questions, but I'll ask you a question of Katelyn. It's always super cool to see these maps, and that's where, I just have so many thoughts. But I'll ask you a question that I actually wasn't going to ask until your answer to Ellery, because I didn't think you'd have an answer to it, but maybe you do. One of the things that we've wrestled a lot with Lake Ontario is that we can't separate the influence of bathymetry, fetch, and ice cover in terms of what is going on in terms of why these habitats are suitable. And, trying to wrestle how to disentangle some of these. Sounds like maybe you can try and get at that. I mean, your response curves with holding the other variables constant, right? Like that's probably not going, I didn't think that would get you the answer, because that's not how these variables work in their interactions. But yeah, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah. So similar to what I said to Ellery, you can look at just the correlations of when the other variables aren't in the model, and so you can see maybe how one is affecting the other. I don't know if that gets at your question of like disentangling what the mechanism is, right? And so like, is it really just because it's shallow, or is it because that, there's low fetch like that mechanistically, or, is it ice, so I'm not sure that you can disentangle, or especially at the lake-wide scale, what's going on there. Maybe, that's something that can be done with, smaller experiments in the bays and things like that. But we can talk about, looking at how those variables are interacting and separating out what might be influencing what based on extent models.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to see some of that and what you've been able to do there, just to see, even just sort of what patterns emerge, even if there's no answers, just what do we see in terms of the patterns of how those variables are what's the word I'm looking for, how they vary with one another across space and so across some of these different bays that do have variable, habitat geomorphologies, which it's just so interesting to see, like across lakes, between even just Lake Erie and Ontario, just how different some of those habitat suitability models look. It makes me really excited to see like what Lake Superior looks like next to these. Once, hopefully one day we get a similar map for Lake Superior. I do have another question, the question that I was originally going to ask, but I'm happy to pause and see if anyone else wants to jump in.
Go for it.
Okay. So this is related to Jay's question. This is again for Katelyn. I'm curious, I don't know if it's directly related to Jay's question, but this is when I thought of it, thinking about where cisco habitat might be in Lake Erie when we don't have this understanding for a contemporary population. And we're talking about Long Point. And I was wondering, even though I don't think lake whitefish habitat suitability maps have been done, if that could be useful for trying to compare what the lake whitefish habitat suitability map for Lake Erie would look like and see if there's a lot of overlap with the Cisco map or not, to try and get at, yeah, what's driving some of those patterns, and if we might expect them to look really similar to lake whitefish or not at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good next step. I was a little constrained by this methodology, and so we don't have any contemporary Cisco. Yeah, so it's really hard to know what's going on. But there was a strong or the methodology was created to not use proxies, right? And so we wanted to really not assume that Cisco were using the same habitat as lake whitefish. So I think that yes, that could be a next step, but in like the process of doing the suitability models and, you know, in the expert discussions and things like that, it was really focused on like, what is the evidence that we have for Cisco, and like, let's really focus on that and not assume that in Lake Erie, they, you know, had similar habitat or life histories as whitefish, like they might show in other lakes. So
yeah, I mean, I'm curious to see, doing it separately, what they look like in terms of compare and contrast.
yeah.
I don't know if that's easier if you're not sort of going through this big expert elicitation process versus putting a model together and
Yeah.
comparing the maps on your own time. But
Right.
I know that that's not your job anymore.
Yeah.
Katelyn, you do have, I mean, not probably can't pull it up now, but at some point, I mean, you do have round whitefish, or you will have round whitefish, lake whitefish, and Cisco habitat suitability maps for Lake Ontario to kind of get at Taylor's question a little bit. So, yeah, but good
Yeah,
questions.
that is true. Yeah, we did both of those species in Ontario.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Taylor. Arthur.
Yep, I just want to jump in quick. I'm not the whitefish specialist on Lake Erie, but I can provide a little bit of context potentially to those questions related to Long Point Bay and where whitefish are in Lake Erie.
Perfect. Yes.
So a lot of whitefish will be in the west basin of Lake Erie around spawning time, as well as around the Detroit River area. So I do realize that was a bit of a hot spot around the Pelee Island area in your map, Katelyn. So like that would potentially be an interesting area to look for Cisco. For Long Point Bay, we don't really have a lot of, or I'm not aware of any lake whitefish spawning in that area. I know the inner bay is quite shallow, like 1 to 2 meters. But it is good spawning habitat for other species like smallmouth bass, for example. It's kind of a wetland ish area, so a lot of warm water species are in there. But yeah, just want to provide a bit of context.
Oh, that was perfect. I'm glad you jumped in and provided that. It's interesting that whitefish are not really using Long Point. So yeah, thanks for that. Dr. Muir.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to add something to Taylor's question and response that Katelyn provided, not directly related to Taylor's question of overlap between whitefish and Cisco, but one of the sort of intents down the road was that we would overlay all of these maps for the purpose of planning restoration, because that's one of the unique parts about this approach and the methods is that, you know, we are dealing with conservation and restoration simultaneously. And so if there are, for example, extant populations of cisco in some places that we don't want to affect by restoration, by sort of layering these habitat maps, it gives fishery managers a much more robust way to plan activities and efforts. So it kind of gets at, to some extent, your question. But the intent is ultimately that we will be able to kind of put these resources together and likewise look at sort of viability for multiple species when managers are starting to plan a restoration program or something. Thank you.
Yeah, great point, Andrew. Thanks. All right, any more questions out there? I'm not seeing anybody with a hand raised, or I don't think I'm missing anything in the chat. Got some follow-up there to Gavin's questions.
I don't know how to raise my hand on this thing, but
Hey,
I've got
Zach.
I've got a question.
Yes, perfect.
Um, given the importance of spawning habitat's conditional on having a population. We need good areas for them to spawn, and those eggs need to survive. Um, Spawning habitat has been just, greatly reduced in Lake Erie and has come back. Whitefish are spawning in areas that we don't think they were before. I'm curious about Cisco. When we release these things, are people thinking about spawning areas? Are there any assessments going on in Long Point or plans to do spawning assessments outside of the western basin of Lake Erie? Like in Long Point we've done a little bit along the southern shore looking for whitefish eggs, but I mean, given the importance of spawning habitat to the survival of Cisco, are we thinking about setting up something like that?
I can try to answer that. I don't know if Katelyn or Laura wanted to address that first.
I don't know the answer to that, Bo. So if you have insight.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'd say is that these are like hot off the press results that Laura shared, but it shouldn't be that surprising to us. It sort of fits with the model, especially that's been emerging in Lake Ontario with the importance of the bottleneck potentially of spawning habitat at that egg stage. I know that in terms of like the experimental reintroduction that is going on for Lake Erie, Cisco, and New York waters, I know that New York DEC has been doing some, cold water habitat assessment work. I don't think Jason or is anybody on here from DEC that can better speak to that? I'm going to speak. And so it's really better if you probably hear it from them, but they've been doing some lake trout. They found wild lake trout emerging there in those eastern basin waters, probably consistent with some of the Corrigonian spawning habitat to some extent. And so it's definitely on their radar in terms of looking for spawning habitat. And they could talk about some experimental work that they're going to be doing this summer, in fact, to clean off some reefs around Brockton Shoals, I think it is. But certainly there is more that could be done. So if anybody out there is listening, we hope to have a Corrigonian call for proposals coming up again this summer that would be supported by GLRI. And one of the points of emphasis for those proposals are always to do work that's in support of ongoing restoration. And building on some of the results that Laura is showing us, sort of pointing to the importance of spawning habitat and knowing, ground truthing some of Katelyn's model predictions, looking, measuring some of that habitat. You can imagine some experiments that you might sort of try to undertake in different habitats across the Great Lakes to give us some more estimates of that egg survival that was so critical in Laura's model. All of those things would be probably very welcomed sort of in that call for proposals once it comes out. Probably in a month or so is what we're hoping for. So that's kind of a long answer. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in there in this discussion, provide more context.
Not specific to spawning, but I think there is plans to tag whitefish around Long Point. Currently, our efforts have been directed to kind of the West Basin, and we've seen them kind of move across Lake Erie and return in the fall. But I think that might help identify what whitefish are doing in that area as well, because it's hard to do a spawning study in Long Point if we don't know if there's anything there. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Arthur. And I know that I don't think Robin DeBruni is on the call, but she was funded to build on some of the work that you did, Zach, with others looking for evidence of a larval production in advance for some baseline numbers, like going into Eastern Basin, as well as some other known sites, using some different methods to look for the larval stage. But I'm not aware of any sort of proposals to do egg deposition work or egg survival work.
Or a habitat assessment of just comparing what's available, what may be available to where we know they like to spawn. The ground truth. Okay.
No, not specifically, other than sort of this the stuff that I know New York is doing, but I don't know it well enough to really speak fully to the breadth of what they're doing. Yeah. And I'm not sure about Ontario either. See Sarah on. Arthur, I'm not sure where you're from. Sorry, I don't think I've met you, but
Oh, sorry. Lake Erie Management Unit. So I'm out of the Port Dover office.
Perfect. Okay.
Right by Long Point. So
Okay.
a lot of our programs around that area.
Nice. Fantastic. Well, I'm really glad you joined. All right.
Cool. Thanks, Bo.
Good question, Zach. All right. Any final thoughts? Thanks to so many of you for hanging on with us for all of this fun discussion as well. As I said, we're going to take a break for the summer. We'll be back in September. Renee will send out information on the listserv August or so, probably, for you to sign up for that. And we are looking to fill some slots in the fall. So if you're interested, please reach out to Renee or to myself to get on our schedule. Until then, we hope to see everybody in September. Have a great summer, everybody.